let's look at some problems that involve trig graphs. Once again, I don't have the time to teach this material, but I will quickly review what we're going to need to use for these next few problems. For trig graphs, there are basically two standard equations. We have the equation for the sine, so y equals a times the sine of omega x minus phi. And then for the cosine, looks identical except it's a cosine instead of a sine. This a is called the amplitude. And we have a capital T called the period, and we have this little equation or formula where the period, t equals 2 pi over omega. And then the last thing is the phase shift. And the phase shift equals this phi over omega. So this is the information that we're going to need to use as we begin to work on these problems involving trig equations. So let me set this aside and start to look at some of these problems. So for instance, this first problem says determine the amplitude and period of the following function without graphing. Let me rewrite the equation over here. -7 times the sine of 4x. Now I'm going to compare that to the standard equation. Now there's no phase shift. There's no phi here, so it's just going to be a sine of omega x. So when you compare those, you realize that the amplitude is -7. Of course, the amplitude is always a positive number. We don't have a negative amplitude. And then omega is 4. Now we know from this little formula here, if we know omega, we can plug it in here and get our period. So the period is 2 pi over omega. Since omega is 4, turns out the period should be pi over 2. So, pretty straightforward. The next one, determine the amplitude and period of the following function without graphing. Same idea. They want the amplitude and the period. We're here, A is going to be 2, so the amplitude is 2. The omega, in this case, is pi, so the period is 2 pi over omega, 2 pi over pi. Those pi's cancel out, and the period should be 2. So actually both answers are 2, and that is correct. Next one, -8/9 times cosine of 7/6x. Once again, this is going to be the amplitude is -8/9, or since the amplitude is never negative, we say 8/9. 7/6 is omega. Period is 2 pi over omega. 2 pi over 7/6. Here we have complex fraction. What happens is the 6 goes up to the top, so 6 times 2 pi, 12 pi over 7. Should be the period. So you can see these aren't too difficult. You just take the equation you're given, and by looking at the standard equation, you can figure out what you need And you can go from there. Let's look at the next one. Now the next one, we look at it, there is going to be a phase shift now. So let's just write this out to make it clear. So here's my trig equation. Here's the standard so you can see once again A is going to be 6, omega is going to be 3, phi is going to be pi. And we need to find the amplitude, the period, and the phase shift. Amplitude is just A, so that's 6. Period is 2 pi over omega, 2 pi over 3, which is, that's the actual answer, does not simplify. Now the phase shift is phi over omega. So phi is pi, so let's write this, the phase shift, phi over omega. Phi is pi, omega is 3. Looks like the phase shift is pi over 3. All right, let's see what's next. We have another one, amplitude, period, and phase shift. Looks to me like A is 2, omega is 6. Here it's a little tricky because you notice the standard equation is omega x minus phi. This is plus pi over 2. Phi has to be negative pi over 2 here. So the amplitude is 2. The period is 2 pi over omega, which reduces to pi over 3. And the phase shift, it's phi, negative pi over 2 over omega. Omega is 6. Simplify this complex fraction, the 6 goes up here in the bottom. It should be negative pi over 12. Now, very bottom of this page, different kind of problem. Now they actually give you the graph of a trig function, and they want you to find the equation. Now they say it's either going to be a sine graph or a cosine. Now it really could be either one, but they say what you have to do is you have to realize that here the angle is 0. So when the angle is 0, when you think about the unit circle, what's the sine and what's the cosine? When the angle is 0, cosine's 1, sine is 0. We look at this trig graph. When the angle is 0, the value of the function is high. That means this has to be a cosine. So therefore, first step is to realize the answer is going to be a cosine. Because if it was a sine, the sine wave starts down here and would go up. But instead, when the angle is 0, the function is high, which means it's a cosine. So now we just have to determine what is A and what is omega. Well, A is going to be easy because you can see it goes from 2 to -2. So the amplitude is going to be 2. So 2 cosine. Now we need to find omega. Well, the period is 2 pi over omega. Now, period is how far the wave goes before it begins to repeat. So it starts here at high, goes down, bottoms out, comes back up, and goes high again. So you can see, starting here to here is when the wave starts to repeat, because here and here it's doing the same thing. So this is the period. Well, how far did we go? We went from 0 to 4 pi. So the period's 4 pi, so t is the period. If I'm going to solve this for omega, multiply both sides by omega, divide both sides by 4 pi. When you do that, so you do a little bit of algebra, you end up with omega was 2 pi over 4 pi. That's actually 1/2. So the equation for this cosine wave should be 2 times the cosine of 1/2 x. So we have next. So here's another problem where they give us the graph of the trig function, and they want us to determine what the equation is. So once again, it can either be sine or cosine. The key is what happens when the angle is 0. You can see for this wave, when the angle is 0, the value of the function is 0. Well, when the angle is 0, sine is 0. So this is now going to be a sine wave. So now, just like the last problem, if I can figure out A, the amplitude, and figure out omega, then I'll have the equation of this sine wave. Amplitude is always very straightforward. Looks like it goes from -3 to 3. So A is 3. Now omega, just like the last time, since the period is 2 pi over omega, let's look at this graph and see how far you have to go before the graph begins to repeat. So if I start here, so here it's at 0 and it's going up. So you're going up, then it comes down, and it goes up again, and it gets back to 0, heading up again, just like here. It's heading up at 0, so it looks like from here to here, you can see, right? That's where the wave begins to repeat. And what is this distance here? Well, it's pretty small. I can try and zoom it in. You can see this is 0, this is 6 here. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So each tick mark is 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it looks like the period, which is right here, goes from 0 to 4. So the period, or capital T, is 4. So now I plug that in here. I rearrange this to solve for omega. And I get omega is 2 pi over 4. which reduces down to pi over 2. So I go up here, if omega is pi over 2, I have pi over 2x. And that should be the equation of this graph, and that is correct. All right, so we have next. Okay, next, sort of interesting. Now they give us some information about the trig function, and they want us to fill in and figure out what is the equation, excuse me. So this right here is really going to be the standard equation. Let me try and write it below. So y equals a times the sine of omega x minus phi. So really I'm trying to figure out what a is. That's going to go here. So in a sense, a is this box, omega is this box, and the phi is this box. We're given this information. Amplitude is always the easy one, 8. So the 8's going to go here. That's A. I need to find omega. I'm given the period. But if you remember our little relationship or formula here, the period is 2 pi over omega. They tell me the period is pi. So I have 2 pi over omega equals pi. If we solve for omega, in a sense, maybe think about swapping the omega and the pi. When you do that, you get 2 pi over pi. The pi's cancel. Omega ends up being 2. And finally, we're given the phase shift. Now we know that the phase shift, the formula for the phase shift is phi over omega. Thing I remember for the period and the phase shift, the omega for both of these in the denominator. So if you get confused sometimes, omega is always in the denominator. So we're told the phase shift is 1/4. 1/4 equals phi. Now we know omega. We just found omega to be 2. So now I have an equation where I can solve for phi. So I multiply both sides by 2. Two over 4, which is 1/2. So it looks a little disjointed here, but it's y. Just for fun, we could write it. It's really y equals 8 sine of 2x minus 1/2. That's what it is when you fill in the boxes. So I'm checking to make sure I did that one correctly. And yes, it is correct. So here's another one of the same kind of problem. For this one, we're told the amplitude is 4. Period's 3 pi, the phase shift is -1/7. So once again, this box is going to be A, this box is omega, and this is going to be phi. Amplitude is A, so it's 4. Period, 3 pi. The formula for the period is 2 pi over omega. If I solve for omega, it's 2 pi over 3 pi, which is 2/3. phi, the phase shift, which is -1/7, equals phi over omega. Phi over omega is 2/3. So this is a little messy, but really what we have here is -1/7 equals phi over 2/3. I can multiply both sides by 2/3. So you get 2/3 times -1/7, which is going to be -2 over 21. So if I rewrite this whole equation, it looks like it's y equals a times the sine of 2/3 x minus 2 over 21. Now I'm looking at the answers, and the only thing I'm worried about, they say the answer is 2 over 21. But I'm pretty sure, let's think about this some more. Should this be positive or negative? And I'm pretty sure it should be negative. So, all right, I'm going to stick with that for now. But we'll have to think about that some more. Okay, so that's a lot of problems on trig graphs. And the next problem is something different. So let's go ahead and stop for now. Although, while I have a second here, just for fear of misleading you, the standard equation is a times the sine of omega x minus phi and phi is, the phase shift is phi over omega. The thing I can think of is when they define phase shift, it's negative, they want it to be positive, but that's not very clear to me. So if there's ever a problem like this on the test, I'll make sure it's okay.